guys, Cassie here. Welcome back to my channel. First things first, I want to apologize if you can hear any like fuzzy sounds. I've spent tons of time getting prepared to do this video, and then somebody started doing some really loud work out in their yard, which like never happens. So that was a little annoying, but we're just gonna push through and keep going. So today we are going to be reverse engineering the outline for The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins using Blake Snyder's 15-beat plot sheet. That was not the way I planned to say that. We're using the Save the Cat method is what I'm trying to say by Blake Snyder, which if you watched my Tuesday video, you might be thinking, but Cassie, you said that you were going to be outlining the Hunger Games using your method of plotting. And I will say to you, that is true, viewer. I did say that. But as I started trying to think through that more, I realized that my personal method for plotting a novel is kind of all over the place, so I think it would be really hard to do a structured video using that method. So I'm going to go ahead and start out this month's series with Blake Snyder's method because it's really simple, really easy to understand, and I think it'll be a good start. So basically what we're doing here today is we are making an outline for the Hunger Games using Blake Snyder's plot beats. And the purpose of this exercise is mostly to just familiarize ourselves better with different plotting methods, in this case, the Save the Cat method, using a book that we probably all are somewhat familiar with, enough to know the story and not be totally lost while I'm talking about it. I hear people talk about a lot of things like plotting methods and just writing advice, and a lot of times I often wish that they would give more tangible examples of people following that advice in stories that we all probably know. For example, as I was going through this and kind of preparing for this video, I realized there's a really good example in this story of good character agency, I guess is how you would say it, because the whole story of the Hunger Games obviously centers on Katniss Everdeen being one of the tributes in the Hunger Games. Obviously, if she didn't get picked for the Hunger Games, then there would be no story. But Suzanne Collins could have accomplished that by having Katniss just get chosen randomly at the reaping. But instead of Katniss being chosen at the reaping, instead her younger sister gets chosen, which now puts it into the protagonist's hands to actually make a choice to get involved into the story, if that makes sense. So instead of the Hunger Games just sort of happening to Katniss, she actually made the choice to participate in the games, which is just, I think, a really good tangible example of how to create good character agency. That was just kind of a side note that I happened to notice and was like, what? That's really cool, because I've been trying to think recently about making sure that my characters are making choices and that things aren't just happening to them. So I thought that was a good tangible example. All right, so let's get into the outlining. So I have the 15 plot beats listed out here, and I also have some notes that I'm going to be discussing along the way. The first of which is up here. So this is just a quick note to remind us that we should start out Act 1 knowing the 6 things that need fixing, either with the main character or with the world. This is just a note to remind us that as we go into these plot beats, this isn't like our very first initial brainstorming phase. Like if we were pretending to be Suzanne Collins making an outline for the Hunger Games, we would already have some things in mind. So I kind of jotted down 6 things that I think need to change in the Hunger Games story, like at the beginning of the story. So things I came up with are, number 1, the games need to be abolished. Number 2, the totalitarian government needs to be overthrown. Number 3, the class system needs to find more balance. Number 4, Katniss needs to learn to open up her heart to people. Number 5, Katniss needs to learn how to put on a face and play the game and work the system instead of just being a sassy rebel all the time. And number 6, Katniss needs to see her potential as a leader of the rebellion, because at the beginning phases of the story, she definitely doesn't have that confidence in herself to know that she could be a good leader, and she just doesn't have that vision for how she could really change the world in the way that she does throughout the story. So that's going to be the very first sticky note that I'm going to put on our outline down here, which we will look at the end of the video. That just gives us an idea of where we're going to start, kind of the themes we're going to be keeping in mind as we create our outline. So first things first, I want to say that these green plot beats here are all part of something called the thesis, which is the world before the story. So that's just kind of what this whole section of the story is supposed to be, the world before the story. All right, so first things first, we have the opening image. And The Hunger Games has, I have to say, a really freaking great opening image. The opening image is supposed to, Okay, so now my heater just turned on. The noises outside have stopped, but my heater just turned on. I turned it off, but it takes a while to kick off, so hopefully in a little while you won't hear that noise anymore. Anyway, so the opening image is supposed to set the tone for the story, and I think this first paragraph here is just like perfection for setting the tone of The Hunger Games. It says, "When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold. My fingers stretch out, seeking Prim's warmth, but finding only the rough canvas cover of the mattress. She must have had bad dreams and climbed in with our mother. Of course she did. This is the day of the reaping." So already that one paragraph tells us so much about the story. First of all, she wakes up and the other side of the bed is cold, which means two things, one of which it's a cool climate, and another is that maybe they don't have the money to have good heating system. And then she says that her fingers stretch out, seeking Prim's warmth. So now we know that there's supposed to be another person sleeping beside her, which we very quickly in the next paragraph find out is her sister. So that also tells us two things. One, that she has a sister that she's close with, and because she's seeking her warmth, it tells you that they're close, and also that Katniss is kind of protective of her. And the second thing this alludes to also, again, is their lack of money, because the sisters are sleeping in the same bed, which is likely because they don't have enough money for them to each have their own bed. This is further illustrated when she says that her fingers only find the rough canvas cover of the mattress, which shows us that they don't have like sheets and blankets and stuff to cover up the rough cover of the mattress. The next few sentences go on to say that she must have had bad dreams and climbed into bed with their mother, which tells us that they're sisters. And then it says, of course she did, this is the day of the reaping. So that part of the opening image tells us that the reaping is something bad and ominous that's looming over them. It's the day of the reaping, and obviously that is a thing that is nightmare worthy. So that was a really strong opening image. It definitely sets the tone for the story. It tells you a lot right off the bat about the characters, and it also leaves you at the end of the very first paragraph with a question that you're really interested to find the answer to. You want to know what the reaping is and why it's giving Prim nightmares. So I'm just gonna jot that down for our little mock outline that we're making here. All right, so the next plot point is the theme stated. Now, The Hunger Games has a lot of different themes, as most stories do, but I would say, in kind of my own thoughts about the story and reading other people's ideas of what the themes of The Hunger Games is, I would say that the ones that stick out the most to me are society and class, the imbalance of power between the government and the people, and of course the overarching idea of sacrifice. The themes of the book are stated in various ways. A lot of that is just in the beginning narration as Katniss is explaining what the reaping is and talking about the war and how the Hunger Games originated. So I would say that would kind of cover the themes stated section, just sort of that beginning part in probably just chapter 1, where Katniss is sort of explaining to us the history of this new world that we're being introduced to. Plot beat number 3 is the setup, which is just sort of the background for the story, which is not really like a specific tangible moment I can point to, like this is the setup of the Hunger Games. It's just kind of the first chapter as the narration sort of explains their lives, I guess. The next plot beat is the catalyst, which in fiction writing is what we would usually refer to as the inciting incident. This is the moment where a change happens that sets the story in motion. And I think it's pretty clear to say that the catalyst or inciting incident of the Hunger Games is when Prim gets chosen for the Reaping. Not for the Reaping. She gets chosen in the Reaping for the games. The next plot beat is the debate, which is the point in which the protagonist has to make a choice or a series of choices. And in this situation, I would say the debate is kind of a snap decision moment. It's not really drawn out very much because Katniss has to decide right then that she's going to volunteer as tribute to replace her sister and participate in the Hunger Games. Which, can we all just take a moment to appreciate how much Jennifer Lawrence is amazing and totally makes us cry in that moment?
Prim! Prim! I volunteer! I volunteer as tribute!
Next we have the break into Act 2, and there's a note accompanying that. So the note to keep in mind for the break into Act 2 is that the protagonist should be proactive in this decision. She should be the one pushing us into Act 2, which is kind of what I talked about in the beginning with just Katniss having good character agency, in that she is the one who chooses to participate in the Hunger Games. She wasn't just chosen at random like Prim and Peeta were and all the other tributes. Well, I mean, except the careers, but that's a whole different story. She actively chose to put herself into the story and to propel the story into this direction. Another note for the break into Act 2 says that the characters should be leaving an old situation and entering a new one, which is definitely a great description of Katniss in this moment. This break into Act 2 kind of encompasses all the scenes starting from the point where Katniss volunteers as tribute, all through like her saying goodbye to her family and getting on the train and being introduced to Effie and Haymitch, you know, all of that kind of stuff. Next up, we are moving into the blue category of plot beats, and those are referred to as the antithesis. I dropped my sticky note. And the antithesis section is referred to as a bizarre version of the world in Act 1. Which I will admit I do not fully understand because I haven't actually read Blake Snyder's book Save the Cat yet. I've just went through and researched like the plot beats themselves and some notes about them. But I would say it kind of makes sense that like the themes present in the world of like District 12 and all the districts and Panem and all of that are present still in the Hunger Games and during like all of their training and all that, but it is kind of like a bizarre version of that same sort of world. Power dynamics are still there, the people are still sort of the same, but they're in a really strange and complicated situation that isn't normal for them. So the first plot beat in this category is the B story, which is basically just a secondary plot line, which is generally oftentimes a love story. And I would say the big punch as far as the introduction to the B story would be when Peeta announces to the Capitol on television that he's in love with Katniss, and that kind of starts, well, it gets us to realize that there is a romance that's going to be happening here, even if it's kind of fake at first, at least. And it also gets us to question whether or not Peeta's interest in Katniss is fake, or if he's telling the truth, or if he's just kind of putting on a face for the games. Basically, it introduces a B story. It introduces a secondary plot line. We're not just thinking about the games anymore. Now we're thinking about this romance and whether or not that's going to be something in the future. Next up, we have the fun and games. Blake Snyder refers to this as the promise of the premise. So basically, when we came into reading this book, The Hunger Games, we were promised a premise that these kids are gonna have to enter this competition to the death. That was the premise that was promised to us, and the fun and games is the stage in which that promise is delivered. So this would be, of course, the introduction to the games. I guess you could say that this starts during the training phase when they're, getting prepared to enter the arena, but the big punch really happens as the tributes are raised. Tributes are raised up into the arena and the games begin. Blake Snyder also says that this is where a lot of trailer moments come from because, of course, this book, Save the Cat, if you're unaware or not familiar, is written really for screenwriting purposes, not for novel writing. So these are kind of the big moments that probably will make up a lot of the trailer. There was many better ways to say that sentence, but I'm not going to try it again. This is also the point of the story in which the fish is most out of the water, he says, which is definitely true for our protagonist Katniss, because obviously she's never been in a position before of having to fight other teenagers to the death. Also, as promised in the premise, this is when a lot of the initial violence is showcased, when Katniss first enters the arena and everything is chaos and is kind of like, this thing that we've been looking forward to in a morbid way for most of the book since we read the back. It's finally coming to fruition and we are seeing what we were promised would be delivered. I just realized I totally forgot to read this note for the break into Act 2, which we've already done here in Plot Beat 6. Act 2 is referred to as the transformation section. The hero should come into this act in one way and leave it changed. So I would say that Katniss comes into this situation around that point when they're doing their training and Peeta announces his feelings for her, and then the games commence. At this point, Katniss is very scared and she's not very confident in her abilities. Everyone else seems to see her as like a front runner, and she clearly doesn't feel that way herself, and she's kind of resigned herself to, in a way, she's not like super cynical about it. Like, I think she's still fighting, but she has kind of resigned herself, I think, to the fact that she's probably not gonna make it out alive. And she definitely doesn't see herself as this big, like, powerful rebel that could lead a nation. And even President Snow can see that, but Katniss definitely doesn't see it herself. He has kind of he has his sights on her because he knows that she has potential, but she hasn't figured that out yet. So that's definitely a big transformation that happens between this point and the break into Act 3, which we'll get to in a minute. So the next plot beat is the midpoint, and this is the point in which stories A and B should cross, and there should be some sort of false victory or false defeat. This is also a point in which the stakes are raised and the pacing is accelerated. Things are really starting to happen now. And I would say the midpoint in the Hunger Games would be when the game makers announce that 2 tributes can be victors of this year's Hunger Games as long as they come from the same district. This definitely raises the stakes and it kind of kicks the pace into high gear, especially because this happens right after Rue is killed and Katniss is sort of at a low point where she is kind of giving up and things are sort of slowing down. And this really kicks the stakes up into high gear. It also brings the A story and the B story together because it reintroduces Peeta into the story and Katniss has to go find him and they have to work together as a team, and we get to see more of their love interest blossoming, and we're reminded that that B story is still there and relevant. And as far as the false victory or false defeat, I wouldn't say this is exactly a false victory, but it is definitely a, we will see later, bit of a false spark of hope. They haven't found victory yet, but there's definitely a new hope for Katniss that she might actually be able to make it out of this alive, and that Peeta might be able to join her because the rules have been changed. Plot beat number 10, the bad guys close in. This is when the villains regroup and push forward, and I would say that this moment is probably sort of right around the time when Peeta and Katniss and Cato and I think Thresh are the last 4 victors remaining, and the game makers sort of kick it into high gear and they introduce new threats with those big creepy dog creatures that are after them, kind of pushing them all towards the center of the arena for a big finale. As Katniss is continually reminded throughout this story, the villains are not the other tributes. The villain in this story really is the Capitol, and they are certainly closing in at this moment. Then comes the all is lost moment. Now this is a moment that should mirror the midpoint. Whereas in the midpoint we had sort of a false victory, now in the all is lost moment we should be experiencing a false defeat. I would say that this point is after Thresh and Cato have died and Katniss and Peeta are the only ones left. They think that they can just go home now because they're the last 2 victors and they're both from the same district. But then the game makers announce that that rule has been changed again and now there can only be 1 remaining victor. This is definitely a low point and a false defeat, all is lost kind of moment. Next up comes the Dark Night of the Soul. This is basically just a fancy way of saying that everything is going to crap and your protagonist is at their very, very lowest point in the story where, again, all hope is lost and they feel like they are completely defeated. Now, the Dark Night of the Soul moment in the first Hunger Games book, I would say is pretty quick. It's not usually this quick. I'd say usually it's like a chapter or so of feeling lost and defeated and like everything's crappy. But in the Hunger Games, it does happen pretty quickly, and I would say this is the moment, again, after the game makers announce that the rules have been changed, there can only be 1 victor, and Katniss and Peeta are left to decide which one of them is going to have to die for the other one to live. And it's a moment where the theme of the imbalance of power between the government and the people is introduced again, and it's a moment where the characters are reminded again that they are so powerless against the Capitol and they really are just pawns in their little game. So all is lost, definitely experiencing the Dark Night of the Soul. And then we have the break into Act 3. The note I have for the break into Act 3 says that the A story and B story have come together, which we've definitely accomplished. Katniss and Peeta are definitely a team now. We've seen a lot of romance blossoming between them. Whether or not that romance was real is still yet to be determined. And this also notes that characters from the B story can kick you into Act 3. So whereas in the break into Act 2, the protagonist was supposed to be the one really driving that change and responding to the catalyst or the inciting incident. For the break into Act 3, it is more acceptable for other side characters or the B story characters to be involved in that change as well. The break into Act 3 is the eureka moment where if your story has kind of a happy ending, I guess, this is when the hero or the B story character realizes the solution to the problem. And in the Hunger Games, this would be the moment in which Katniss and Peeta decide to eat the poisonous berries and just both kill themselves instead of allowing the Capitol to have their victor, kind of as a last little middle finger to the Capitol instead of allowing them to win. This also brings a couple of the main themes back, like the theme of sacrifice and also the theme of the imbalance of power between the government and the people. Katniss and Peeta are kind of restoring some of that balance by saying, no, you don't get to decide this, you don't get to have that power over me, I can still make this decision. Now, my note for Act 3 says that the things that are wrong in the world or in the hero in Act 1 should be resolved. So that list of 6 things that we found that were wrong, problems that need to change throughout the story, should be resolved at this point. However, because The Hunger Games is part of a trilogy, that rule doesn't really apply quite the same. Some of the things should be resolved, or at least partially resolved, because you want to feel like there was a reason you read this story other than just being a bridge to the next story. But you definitely don't want everything to be resolved, because then there would be nowhere left to go. So going back to this list of 6 problems that need to be solved in the story, the games need to be abolished. They haven't been abolished, but they have kind of been challenged greatly by Peeta and Katniss's little rebellion at the end, and now there are 2 victors because of course they didn't allow them to kill themselves, so that's never happened before, and they're kind of giving hope to the nation that the people have more power than they think that they do over the Capitol. Number 2, the totalitarian government needs to be overthrown. Again, it hasn't been completely overthrown yet, of course, because this isn't the end of the story, but there has been a lot of challenge, and that definitely sets us up for a really interesting sequel. Number 3, the class system needs to be balanced. Again, I think it hasn't been completely balanced, but there has been a lot of bridges gapped. There were definitely a lot of moments where Katniss was aware that the other tributes are just regular people like her, and even though they sort of have an imbalance because of their caste, they're all in the same position and they're kind of all on the same level. So there has been some balance restored there, especially given Katniss and Peeta's rebellion at the end of the story. That's definitely given hope to the rest of the districts that more balance can be restored in the future. So while none of the 3 of those problems have been completely solved, we've definitely seen all 3 of those problems have some major ground covered, and we can see the light at the end of the tunnel now. Number 4, Katniss needs to learn to open her heart to people. I think Peeta did kind of teach her a little bit of that, but I think that's probably one of the challenges, at least the ones that I came up with to this story, that hasn't changed very much yet in the first book. I think Katniss takes a few books more before she's kind of opened up her heart more to love and, you know. Number 5, Katniss needs to learn how to put on a face and play the game / work the system instead of just being sassy and rebellious all the time. I think that problem actually has definitely been resolved by the end of the story. Katniss has definitely learned that. She played the game and worked the system very well in the arena, pretending to have a romance with Peeta and kind of hamming that up for the cameras to get medicine for him and other gifts from their sponsors. And we also see definitely at the end of the story that she is still doing that. She still recognizes that the games aren't over yet. Even though she's out of the arena, she still has to put on that face and kind of play the game instead of just hating the game. Number 5, did I say? I feel like I said the wrong numbers. Anyway, next one is Katniss needs to see her potential as a leader of the rebellion. I don't think that has been accomplished yet in this story, but again, it's one of those things that we can kind of see the light coming at the end of the tunnel. Oh, and that was the last one. That was number 6, not number 5. That's why I was confused. So now we're moving into the synthesis, which is where synthesis, which is where the worlds from Act 1 and Act 2 are merged in some way. That is absolutely true of this story, actually, because the world of Act 1 was kind of Katniss in District 12 and all the complications going on there, and then the world of Act 2 was the games themselves, and by the time we get to Act 3, we are definitely seeing the two worlds collide, because Katniss and Peeta, as they leave the arena, they realize that this sort of fake relationship they've built, they can't just go home and tell everybody, oh, that was all just fake. They have to continue this life. And also, they're victors now. So they're rich, they have new houses, they have, like, their whole lives are different now. So that's definitely a great example of the worlds from Act 1 and Act 2 merging together by Act 3. I have to say, actually, as I've been going through this book, that Suzanne Collins' book, The Hunger Games, really matches up very well with Blake Snyder's 15-beat plot system, like perfectly well. I was a little worried that it might be hard to kind of fit a random book into this method, because she probably didn't use this exact outlining method when she wrote it, but it actually works out really well, so it's no wonder it's such an amazing story. Next we move into the finale, which is where we should be seeing the protagonists solving problems, defeating villains, and changing the world for the better. And I would say, again, because this is part of a trilogy, this isn't going to fit quite well, because we aren't defeating all the villains yet, and we aren't completely changing the world, and we aren't solving all the problems either. But as we've already discussed, we've definitely seen a lot of problems being solved. We've seen a lot of light at the end of the tunnel and a lot of hope going forward. And finally, we have the final image, which should be a mirror of the opening image, and it should show some of the lessons the characters have learned and how the world has changed. And I think the final image of The Hunger Games actually, again, does this really, really well. So there's kind of two scenes I want to point out. One is at the end of the games, after they're out of the arena, when they're having their interview with Caesar, and he's kind of talking to them about what happened in the games, and we're seeing how Katniss and Peeta, they're both still playing the game, even though they're not in the arena anymore. They still have those plastic smiles. They're still talking about their relationship. They're still pretending to be in love when they aren't really yet, or at least Katniss isn't there yet. And then it moves into sort of Katniss and Peeta together talking about whether or not the things they said and did in the games were real, and Peeta clearly has feelings for Katniss, and it's clear that she was more playing it up for the game and for strategy than he was. And then the final image of the book is they're on the train and they're coming back to District 12, and they hold hands. Peeta says, okay, I'm just gonna read this part. Out of the corner of my eye, I see Peeta extend his hand. I look at him unsure. One more time for the audience, he says. His voice isn't angry, it's hollow, which is worse. Already the boy with the bread is slipping away from me. I take his hand, holding on tightly, preparing for the cameras and dreading the moment when I will finally have to let go. And that final image, I think, is a really good mirror of the first image. Maybe not like that final picture in your head, I guess, but it definitely, those last few scenes definitely show a lot of the lessons that have been learned, and absolutely how the world has changed, because they are about to embark on something completely new. First of all, the fact that Peeta and Katniss are a they now and is already new, because Katniss was on her own before, and now they're a team and they're together and they're victors and they have all these new things. And yeah, I think that really sums it up pretty well. So this is sort of our final outline. We have the 6 points or like problems that need to be solved through the story. We have the opening image, which is where Katniss wakes up to Prim not being in bed. She thinks she must have climbed into bed with their mother because of having bad dreams because it's the day of the reaping. That sets the tone for the story. And we have sort of the theme stated and the setup where Katniss is explaining the war and the Hunger Games and how all of that came to be, and just sort of introducing us to the world of Panem. Then we have the catalyst, which is where Prim gets chosen at the reaping. Onto the debate period where Katniss has to decide whether she's gonna let her sister go join the Hunger Games or if she's gonna volunteer in her place. Then we have the break into Act 2 where Katniss says goodbye to her family, gets on the train, she meets Haymitch and Effie and all of the other tributes. Then we have the introduction of the B story where Peeta admits his feelings for Katniss on camera in front of the whole nation. Then we move into the fun and games period, which is when the training is going on and the actual Hunger Games commence. Then we have the midpoint where the game makers announce that 2 victors can win the game, and Katniss is sort of lured into a false victory or a false hope, and the B story is brought back around. Next we have the bad guys closing in, where the big dog-like creatures are introduced and the game makers are stepping up their game, if you will. Then we move on to the all is lost moment where the game makers announce that now that Katniss and Peeta are the only ones left, they can't win together anymore. There can only be one tribute and they have to decide who's gonna go home and who's going to die. We have the Dark Night of the Soul, which is where the decision must be made which one of them will sacrifice themselves for the other. And in this moment, they are reminded of how powerless they are against the Capitol. And we had the break into Act 3 where Katniss and Peeta decide to eat the berries and stick it to the man, and the game makers stop them and give in and say that they can both be tributes. And after that, we lead into the finale. So that was just obviously a really basic overview of this story. There's so many other subplots in the book of the Hunger Games. This is actually a pretty good overview, I would say, of the movie, because movies are a little, you know, there's not enough time for as many subplots, so a lot of the other little stuff in the book got cut. I would say this covers most of the points of the film. Of course, in a book, there's a lot more than just one B story. There's a B, C, D, E story. So obviously there's a lot more to this story than just this, but I feel like this has been a really comprehensive look at Blake Snyder's 15-beat plot sheet. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Please let me know in the comments below if you liked this, because whether you liked it or not, I'm gonna be doing more of these for the rest of the month is what I'm planning. Every Thursday, we're gonna be going through a different book with a different plotting method. And I had a lot of fun. I learned so much more about, I had already read a lot about the 15-beat structure that Blake Snyder wrote about in Save the Cat, but there was even more that I learned as I was doing the research to film this. So I hope it's been really informative for all of you. Please give it a thumbs up if you liked it, and let me know in the comments below if you're excited to see more, and if you have any other ideas for different plotting methods or novels maybe that you want me to reverse engineer outlines for. Anyway, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you all next time, and have a great day. Bye.